Now we're going to move on to talk about some of the civilizations that emerged alongside ancient Mesopotamia, and we're going to begin with the civilization of ancient Egypt. Ancient Egypt combined the fertility of a great river, in this case the Nile, with the protection of the deserts and the seas. So the deserts and the seas are going to protect Egypt from invasion and give it the stability that Mesopotamia lacked. We've just been talking about how you have this series of invaders that are coming into Mesopotamia and changing the culture, preserving some parts, changing other parts. Egypt is going to be very stable. It's going to be a very conservative society in comparison with ancient Mesopotamia. Even in the rivers, we know that the Nile floods predictably. It deposits important amounts of rich silt, and these were the lands that were farmed by the ancient Egyptians. This is the richest agricultural land around the Mediterranean. And it was so rhythmic that it supported the Egyptians creating a calendar that followed the rhythm of the Nile. And so this is the foundations of the 365-day calendar that we all use today. So we didn't talk about this, but the Babylonians and their mathematics laid the foundation for the 60-minute hour. The Egyptians and their geography laid the foundations for a 365-day year. There was very little rain in Egypt. There are about 16 inches of rain on average each year in Portales. There are about 2 in Egypt. So Egypt is utterly dependent on the Nile and the flooding of the Nile to irrigate the soil. Egypt was divided into 2 halves. Lower Egypt was the Nile Delta, the area by the Mediterranean. Upper Egypt is the area further to the south. It's a little counterintuitive for us because the Nile is flowing from south to north. The Upper Egypt is where the Nile begins in the south, and Lower Egypt is where the Nile empties out into the Mediterranean. Life was based around the Nile. People used the river in the same way that people use roads today. There was little need for wheels or vehicles or roads in ancient Egypt. Around 5000, we find a significant copper culture emerging. By around 3500, Egypt has developed a full-scale farming with dams, dikes, and canals that are used to store water and are used to expand the amount of land that can be farmed using this water. We also see long-distance trade is being established with Mesopotamia and even with sub-Saharan Africa. If you're following along in the PowerPoint, now's the time to move to the next slide. By around the year 3000, all the areas along the Nile had been occupied and settled. And so now, as we saw in Mesopotamia, there's more competition for land. There's a need for a centralized authority. And so here we see the first kings of Egypt, the first king of Egypt named Menes, and kings in Egypt were known as pharaohs. They were not just considered the gods' representatives, they were believed to be gods. They were considered to hold all the land, to own all the land and everything that it produced. They were assisted by a vizier, who was kind of like a CEO, a manager. And below the vizier were the governors of Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt, and then the nomarchs that are kind of the mayors of each city. So that's the government infrastructure. And so Menes is the first to successfully unify Egypt under his rule in what was known as the Old Kingdom. And of course, underneath the nomarchs, we have bureaucrats, artisans, but most of the rest of the population were peasant farmers who worked the land and lived in small permanent houses on ground that was too high to be flooded. There were also some slaves. So a few native slaves. Being a slave, typically, if you were an Egyptian, you became a slave because you committed a crime. Most slaves came from foreign lands and were captured in war. Egypt was safe, secure, and traditional. And it's a far less fluid society than ancient Mesopotamia. In fact, we have no evidence of any published law codes. The consistency of the flooding of the Nile meant the Egyptians were very confident that the gods would take care of them. The pharaoh was so powerful that no one really seems to have challenged his authority, and so ancient Egypt lives in relative isolation and peace and stability from the rest of the world, even as we do start to see evidence of trade from areas outside Egypt. If you move to the next slide, we're going to move on to talk about some of the achievements of the Old Kingdom of Egypt. These were most famously the pyramids and the hieroglyphs. So the pharaohs mobilized huge numbers of the Egyptian population to construct elaborate tombs made out of cut stone rather than mud. Most of the buildings that we've looked at so far have been dried mud, even the temples in ancient Mesopotamia. The Egyptians are going to use cut stone. Each pyramid represents the work of about 100,000 workers working for a period of about 20 years. So it's an enormous project. And these pyramids rose to heights of about 500 feet tall, and they contained probably over 2 million stone blocks. Smaller ones weighed about 2 tons. The larger ones weighed about 15 tons. People tend to think that these pyramids were built by slaves, and that Egypt was the society that was based on slavery. They used slave labor to build these pyramids. Absolutely not the case. This was seen as a way of worshiping the pharaoh. And so on the off seasons, when you're not farming, you would come and you would work on the pyramid. And that was basically the way that you paid taxes. You paid taxes with your labor rather than with money. The workers were well fed and well housed at the pharaoh's expense. Why? Because someone who's in a brutalized condition or in an oppressed condition in any way, there's no way they would have been able to carry out this type of work. And so this is the story behind the building of the pyramids. It gives you a sense of the enormity of these projects, the huge achievement of building something like this. The Egyptians also developed their own system of writing that's called hieroglyphs. And so this is somewhat similar to cuneiform, but it's also a little different. So cuneiform expresses sounds, and we use the sounds like a, b, k, etc. to build words. Hieroglyphs give you concepts. And so there's a symbol that means sailor. So it means you have to have a ton of symbols. And so hieroglyphs mix the two together. You have some letters that represent sounds, some letters that represent concepts. And so that's why it's so difficult to understand. But it was also a sign of Egyptian identity to be able to use hieroglyphs like this. All right. Talked about the foundation of the Old Kingdom and some of its achievements. We'll be back to talk about its fall and the rise of the Middle Kingdom in the next video.